Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about the connection between wilderness survival and self-harm. It's a pretty interesting combo, right? We've got some great sources lined up, too.
Yeah, sounds like a good mix.
Like UW Medicine has some really practical tips for wilderness survival. And then we've got the Mighty, which has some insights into those less obvious forms of self-harm that we might not even realize we're doing.
Interesting.
Yeah. And we'll also be looking at some expert advice on wildlife encounters from the University of Utah and the National Park Service. Oh, and because you never know, we've even got some bear attack survival strategies from the manual. So get ready to learn how to not only survive a bear attack, but also recognize those sneaky ways we might be harming ourselves without even realizing it.
Uh-huh. Yeah, you never know when you might need that bear attack knowledge.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really interesting point you made about how these topics, wilderness survival and self-harm, kind of intertwine. They both really demand that we're prepared and that we're aware of not only the environment around us, but also the one within us.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, you spend all this time packing your backpack and making sure you've got all the gear you need for, like, the physical dangers of the wilderness. But then sometimes you forget about those hidden dangers, both out there and within ourselves. So speaking of wilderness preparedness, UW Medicine talks a lot about, like, packing essentials, even for short hikes, which I'll admit I haven't always been super diligent about.
Yeah, it's easy to think, oh, it's just a quick hike, what could go wrong?
Yeah.
But that's when things tend to happen. UW Medicine really emphasizes the importance of a water filter. And it's not just about like aesthetics or anything you need to think about like Giardia and all those little microscopic dangers. They're lurking in the water, even if it looks clear. And that could easily turn a fun hike into a pretty miserable experience.
Yeah, I know I've always just kind of tossed a water bottle in my backpack, but that point about Giardia really brings it home, like, why we need the gear. You know, it's about being prepared for those hidden dangers that we might not even think about, kind of like those subtle ways we harm ourselves that we were talking about. But we'll come back to that. For now, I want to talk about what happens, Ayesha. Something does go wrong. UW Medicine mentions using branches to, like, splint a broken bone.
Yeah.
How resourceful is that?
That's wilderness MacGyvering right there, using whatever you've got to deal with the situation. But beyond those physical skills, UW Medicine stresses how important it is to stay calm, like in any kind of wilderness emergency. Whether you're dealing with cuts, burn, sprains, having a clear head lets you really assess the situation and give proper first aid.
Yeah, definitely. I remember this one time I was hiking with a friend and she tripped and, like, totally scraped up her knee, and she was freaking out, but it really was a minor injury, and once we cleaned it up and bandaged it, she was fine. So sometimes just like having that basic first aid knowledge and keeping a cool head, that can make all the difference.
Totally. It's all about having that mental preparedness to go with the physical preparedness. And that actually reminds me of what the University of Utah says about encountering wildlife. Being aware of what's around you and moving in a predictable way. Those are key elements of responsible hiking.
Oh yeah, speaking of wildlife, the manual had some pretty intense advice about bear encounters. So apparently you're supposed to play dead for a grizzly, but fight back against a black bear.
Yeah.
Those seem like totally opposite approaches.
Right. It might seem counterintuitive, but each strategy is based on how that specific bear behaves. Like grizzlies tend to be more predatory, so playing dead might convince them that the threat is gone. But black bears can be more territorial, so showing some aggression might make them back down.
Wow, I had no idea. This really shows how important it is to understand the why behind the advice. Just like with that water filter, it's about recognizing that there are layers to these dangers and we need to be prepared for them. But honestly, after reading all this, I think I'm just going to be packing bear spray from now on, And I'm definitely keeping in mind that reminder from the National Park Service about never getting between a mama bear and her cubs.
Yeah, good call.
Talk about a recipe for disaster.
Definitely. And, you know, that idea of respecting boundaries actually applies to other animals, too. Like the University of Utah points out, even herbivores can be dangerous if they feel threatened, especially if you get between a mother and her young. It's all about understanding how animals behave and reacting in the right way.
So we've covered some wilderness prep, basic first aid wildlife encounters. Now I'm curious to dig into how all of this connects to self-harm. The Mighty's article was really eye-opening, especially about those behaviors that we might not even recognize as harmful.
It's so true. We tend to think of self-harm in very specific terms. But the Mighty expands that definition to include things like overspending and isolating ourselves, which can be really damaging in the long run.
Yeah, those are great examples. It's easy to see how those behaviors could kind of spiral out of control, especially if they come from underlying mental health issues. It's like we're neglecting our own well-being without even realizing it.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that those behaviors can be both a symptom and a cause of deeper issues. So, for example, someone might start overspending as a way to cope with feelings of emptiness or low self-esteem, but then the debt and guilt that comes from that overspending just makes those feelings even worse. It's the same with isolation. It might feel safe at first, but then it can lead to loneliness and disconnection, and that just fuels the cycle even more.
Yeah, it's like we're creating our own internal wilderness full of hidden dangers and pitfalls. And just like in the physical wilderness, we need to be prepared to navigate those challenges.
Exactly. And being prepared for that means building a different kind of toolkit, one that focuses on our mental and emotional resilience.
I love that analogy. It's like we need a mental first aid kit filled with coping strategies and ways to get support. But before we unpack that toolkit, I want to dig a little deeper into some of those less obvious forms of self-harm that the Mighty talks about. Things like always putting others' needs before our own or sabotaging relationships. Those examples really hit home for me. I think we've all been there at some point,
Cool.
trying to please everyone and ending up feeling drained and resentful.
Absolutely. And that raises an important question. When does being nice cross the line and become self-sabotage? When does putting others first actually start to damage our own well-being? I think those are questions we all need to think about.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought. It makes you realize that self-harm isn't always as obvious as we might think. It can show up in these subtle ways that slowly chip away at our well-being over time.
Exactly. And that's where awareness is so important. Being able to recognize those patterns and what motivates those actions. That's the first step to breaking free.
So how do we develop that awareness? What are some of the tools we can put in our mental first aid kits to help us navigate those internal wildernesses?
Well, one of the most important tools is self-reflection. Taking the time to really examine our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and understanding the why behind them. Why do we overspend? Why do we isolate ourselves? Why do we sabotage our relationships?
Yeah, that's so important. It's like taking a step back from the trail and looking at our internal map. But sometimes self-reflection is tough to do on our own right.
Definitely. And that's where seeking help comes in. The Mighty emphasizes how those self-harming behaviors are often a cry for support, like a way of communicating distress that we might not even be fully aware of.
That's a really powerful way to look at it. It's like those behaviors are signals, like smoke signals in the wilderness, telling us that something's wrong and we need help. But how do we know when it's time to reach out for that help?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to recognizing those patterns of behavior that are causing us harm or preventing us from living a fulfilling life. If we're constantly engaging in those behaviors, even though we know they're not good for us, that's a sign that we might need some extra support.
Yeah, I see what you mean, but I think there's still this stigma around asking for help, especially when it comes to mental health.
You're absolutely right. There is a stigma, and it's something we definitely need to work on changing. But remember, asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. It takes courage to acknowledge that we need support and that we can't always do it all on our own.
Yeah, that's a really helpful perspective. It's like admitting that we need a map and compass to navigate those tricky parts of our internal wilderness. But I think a lot of people wonder, where do we even start looking for that help?
Well, there are so many resources available, both online and in our communities.
Okay, before we get into those resources, I want to bring us back to wilderness survival for a second. You mentioned earlier that we need to be prepared to navigate those challenges in the physical wilderness. What are some of those skills that we could learn that might also help us navigate our internal wilderness?
That's a really interesting connection. Let's see. In the wilderness, one of the first things you learn is how to build a shelter. And in a way, that's also about creating a safe space, but for our mental and emotional well-being.
Oh, I like that. So what would the building materials be for our internal shelters?
That's a great question. I think it comes down to establishing healthy boundaries, cultivating self-compassion, and practicing self-care. These are the tools that help us create that sense of safety and stability within ourselves.
Okay, and those boundaries. Are those like the walls of our shelter protecting us from those external forces that might try to tear us down?
Exactly. Boundaries are essential for protecting our energy, our time, and our emotional well-being. They help us define what's acceptable and what's not. And they allow us to say no to things that drain us and yes to things that nourish us.
Okay, so if boundaries are the walls of our shelter, what about self-compassion? Where does that fit in?
Self-compassion is like the foundation of our shelter. It's about treating ourselves with the same kindness and understanding that we would offer a dear friend. It's about recognizing that we're all human. We all make mistakes. And we all deserve to be treated with respect, especially by ourselves.
I love that. It's like creating a soft landing pad for those times when we inevitably stumble or fall. And what about self-care? What's its role in building our internal shelters?
Self-care is like the roof of our shelter, providing us with protection and nourishment. It's about prioritizing our physical, emotional, and mental well-being through activities that bring joy, reduce stress, and help us recharge.
It sounds like we're building a pretty solid shelter here. But what about those times when we feel lost or disoriented in our internal wilderness? What are some of the survival skills that can help us find our way back to a place of safety and stability?
That's where mindfulness and grounding techniques come in. These practices help us stay present in the moment, calm our racing thoughts, and reconnect with our bodies and our senses. It's like having a compass and map for our internal landscape.
I love that analogy. It's like those skills help us find our bearings, orient ourselves, and navigate those difficult emotions or situations. And speaking of navigation, what about fire? We talked about fire safety in the wilderness. How does that relate to our internal wilderness?
That's an interesting parallel. In the wilderness, we learn how to manage fire responsibly to keep it from spreading and causing harm. In the same way, in our internal wilderness, we need to learn to manage those inner fires of difficult emotions like anger, anxiety, or fear.
So how do we do that? How do we keep those inner fires from burning out of control?
One way is through those mindfulness and grounding techniques we were talking about earlier. They help us create a safe space for those emotions to exist without completely overwhelming us.
Oh, okay. So it's like we're building a fire pit for those intense emotions, containing them so they can burn safely without causing damage. But sometimes those fires can feel really, really intense, like totally overwhelming.
Absolutely. And that's when it's important to remember that we don't have to face them alone. Just like in the wilderness, where you might signal for help if you get lost or injured. It's okay to reach out for support when those inner fires feel too intense to handle by yourself.
Yeah, that's really reassuring. It reminds us that we're not alone in this journey, and that there are people and resources out there to help us navigate those tough parts of our internal wilderness.
Exactly. And just like in the wilderness, where there are all sorts of different shelters and survival techniques, there are also different kinds of support available to us. It could be talking to a trusted friend or family member, or seeking guidance from a therapist or counselor, or joining a support group.
That's a great point. It's like we have a whole team of wilderness guides to help us find our way. But how do we know which guide is right for us?
That's a question we'll explore in the next part of our deep dive. We'll talk about those different types of support and how to find the resources that best fit your needs.
So we've built our mental shelters, learned how to manage those inner fires, and even talked about finding our way back when we feel lost. But like you said, sometimes we need a guide, someone to help us through those tougher trails. So let's talk about those different kinds of support. Where do we even start?
Well, think of it like choosing a hiking buddy. You trust someone who gets the terrain and someone who can offer support and encouragement along the way.
I like that. So who are some of those hiking buddies we could turn to for support in our internal wilderness?
One of the most accessible and valuable resources is your support network. This could be friends, family members, mentors, or anyone you feel comfortable confiding in.
Yeah, that makes sense. Those are the people who know us best, who've seen us through the ups and downs. But what if talking to friends or family feels a little too close to home? Like, what if we're not ready to share those deeper struggles with them?
I get that. Sometimes it can feel safer and less vulnerable to talk to someone who's not directly involved in our lives. That's where therapists or counselors come in.
So they're like those experienced wilderness guides who can help us navigate those unfamiliar trails.
Exactly. Therapists are trained to help us understand and manage our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They provide a safe and confidential space to explore our challenges and develop coping strategies.
That sounds really helpful, especially when those internal wildernesses feel so vast and overwhelming. But I imagine finding the right therapist can be a little daunting. Where do we even begin to look?
There are a few different ways you can go about it. You could ask your primary care physician for a referral, or contact your insurance provider for a list of therapists in your network, or even search online directories like Psychology Today.
Okay, those are some good starting points. But what about the cost? Therapy can be pretty expensive, and not everyone has insurance that covers it.
You're right, cost can definitely be a barrier. But there are options for people with limited financial resources. A lot of community mental health centers offer sliding scale fees based on income, and some therapists even offer pro bono services.
That's good to know. It makes therapy seem more accessible to people who might not have thought about it before. But what about people who aren't ready for individual therapy? Are there other options out there for support?
Absolutely. Support groups can be incredibly beneficial. They offer a sense of community and shared understanding.
So it's like finding a group of fellow hikers who've been on similar trails, and they can offer support and encouragement based on their own experiences.
Exactly. Support groups provide a space to connect with others who are facing similar challenges. You can share coping strategies and realize that you're not alone in your struggles.
Yeah, that sounds really empowering to know that you're part of a bigger community of support. But there are so many different types of support groups out there. How do we find one that's right for us?
You can check out organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, or Mental Health America. They both have directories of support groups that are organized by topic or location.
Those are great resources. It's like having a map of the support landscape guiding us toward the groups that match our needs. But what about people who might not be comfortable with meeting in person? Are there any online support groups?
Definitely. A lot of online platforms like Reddit or Facebook host virtual support groups. They offer the same benefits as in-person groups, but with added convenience and anonymity.
That's awesome. It really opens up the world of support to people who might not have access to in-person groups or who just prefer the anonymity of being online. But with all these options, it can be hard to know where to start.
Yeah, it's like standing at the trailhead with a map full of possibilities, but you're not sure which path to take.
Exactly. So how do we choose the right path? How do we know what kind of support is best for us?
Well, I think it comes down to personal preference, your comfort level, and the specific challenges you're facing. For some people, just talking to a trusted friend or family member might be enough, but for others, the professional guidance of a therapist might be more beneficial. And for others, the sense of community and shared understanding in a support group might be the perfect fit.
That makes sense. It's like choosing the right gear for our journey through the internal wilderness. You need to consider the terrain, your own strengths and weaknesses, and how much support you feel you need. But no matter what path you choose, it's important to remember that reaching out for help is a sign of strength and courage.
Absolutely. It's like acknowledging that you don't have to go it alone on those challenging trails. You can ask for directions, rely on your map and compass, and seek guidance from those who have been there before.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to think about it, this idea of navigating our internal wilderness with the support of others. But as we've been talking about all these different resources and strategies, I've been thinking, we've focused a lot on recognizing and addressing those negative behaviors that might be harming us. But what about the positive actions we can take to nurture and strengthen our well-being?
That's a great point. Just like in the wilderness, where you need to replenish your energy and resources along the way, it's crucial to cultivate practices that nourish our internal landscapes.
Oh, I like that. So what are some of those trail snacks we can pack for our journey through our internal wilderness?
Well, think about the things that bring you joy, peace, and a sense of fulfillment. It could be spending time in nature, listening to music, engaging in creative pursuits, practicing mindfulness, or connecting with loved ones.
Those are all great ideas. It's like creating a joy kit filled with activities that nourish our souls and lift our spirits. But sometimes even with all the right gear and support, those internal wildernesses can feel really overwhelming. What are some tips for staying motivated and resilient when things get tough?
One of the most important things is to celebrate your successes, no matter how small they might seem.
So it's like pausing along the trail to appreciate the view, to acknowledge how far you've come and how much you've already accomplished.
Exactly. Those moments of celebration, those times when you recognize your progress, they can really boost your motivation and remind you of your strength and resilience. Another helpful tip is to break down your goals into smaller, more manageable steps.
That makes sense. It's like choosing a trail that's right for your skill and fitness level.
Yeah.
We wouldn't try to climb Mount Everest on our first hike, right?
Right. It's about setting realistic expectations and celebrating those smaller wins along the way.
Those are fantastic tips. I feel like I'm starting to see those connections between wilderness survival and navigating the challenges of life.
That's the beauty of it. The skills you learn in the wilderness can be applied to so many parts of your life, from managing your emotions to building resilience to developing a deeper connection with yourself and the world around you.
Yeah, I love that. It's like we've been given this amazing map for navigating both the wilderness within and the wilderness outside. And the more we learn about both of those landscapes, the better prepared we are to thrive no matter where we are.
Exactly. And remember, just as there's always more to explore in the vast wilderness, there's always more to discover about ourselves, our resilience, and our potential for growth.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I've learned so much about wilderness, survival, self-care, and the importance of asking for help. What are your biggest takeaways?
For me, it's how connected everything is. Like how wilderness survival skills can be metaphorical tools for dealing with the challenges of life. Those same principles of preparation, awareness, resilience, and knowing when to ask for help, they apply whether we're facing a physical danger or an emotional one.
I completely agree. It's like we've been given this incredible toolkit for navigating both those wildernesses. But before we wrap up this epic deep dive, I have a question for our listeners. What's one small step you can take today to be a little bit kinder to yourself? Maybe it's packing that water filter for your next hike, or setting a boundary with a friend, or maybe it's just taking a few deep breaths and appreciating the beauty around you. It's all about taking those small steps to nourish your well-being, both out in the wilderness and in your everyday life.
Yeah, those small steps, those little choices we make, they can really create a ripple effect and lead to some big changes in the long run. So I'm curious, what will you choose?
That's a good question, and one I hope our listeners will really think about. And that wraps up our epic deep dive. We covered a lot of ground today, from wilderness survival skills to self-care, from recognizing those hidden dangers to building up those internal shelters.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride exploring those connections between the wilderness within and the wilderness outside. And remember, no matter what challenges you're facing, you don't have to go through them alone. There's a whole community of support out there ready to help you along the way.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
So if you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to subscribe and share it with your friends. We could all use a little more wilderness wisdom in our lives, right?
Absolutely. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep exploring.